For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rabbi Jonathan Hausman. Welcome to my synagogue. We are so delighted that you are here this evening. You know, with our guests this evening, Frank Gaffney, Clare Lopez, and Admiral James Lyons, I don't think we have a better panel. I don't think you can assemble a better panel in this country to discuss the evolving issues of international terror, threats against the United States homeland by ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates. We have with us this evening three of this nation's premier national defense and security experts in this battle for freedom and liberty. And I don't think I'm overstating it. Matter of fact, I will tell you I'm not overstating it. These people are heroes.
Good evening. Where to begin? I guess first with thanks to John, as the secretary, to Matt for putting this program together, enabling an all-center program, actually, in addition to Clare being one of my colleagues at the Center for Security Policy. We also have our chairman of our military committee, Admiral Lyons. So we're really delighted to be here in force and hopefully to do justice to the very important topic of what I think of as the war for the free world. We're going to talk about jihad. Matt mentioned it. You're all obviously thinking about it. I'm going to describe what it is, how it is manifesting itself here in America, not just elsewhere around the world. Some thoughts about what is enabling it and what do we do about it. Okay? So what are we talking about? What is jihad? According to these sorts of sources, the sacred texts, the jurisprudence, the traditions, and the practice going back some 1,400 years that make up the authoritative doctrine known as Sharia, jihad means one thing. And you may have heard from such Muslim scholars as George W. Bush and Barack Obama that what it means is personal struggle to be the best Muslim you can be. But all of these sources say it actually means holy war. And it manifests itself in things like this. Of course, one of the iconic, horrible moments of violent jihad against us. In this, the attack described by our government as workplace violence, a massacre brought by a jihadist, a man who said he was a jihadist, not only on the occasion and afterwards, but in the run-up to it. In his presentations to some of his comrades in arms, that he was going to kill them in order to defend his faith against what they were going to do to Muslims in Afghanistan. Then, of course, recently, this episode, jihadists trying to murder people engaging in the exercise of free expression in our country. But I want to get at something else, which is really important, and that is that if you're not powerful enough as a Muslim to engage in jihad, and let me emphasize, not all Muslims buy that they're supposed to do this. They don't embrace Sharia. They don't believe that it is their God-directed way to conduct themselves. But if they do believe that God has ordered them to engage in jihad to achieve the submission of the rest of the world, but they're just not powerful enough to do it, the preferred way, the violent way, what are they supposed to do then? Well, these guys, the Muslim Brotherhood, have a program that they recommend. They call it Civilization Jihad. What is it? Well, it's been described in a document that was providentially discovered in a secret sub-basement in a suburb of Washington, D.C., not far from where Ace and I and Claire live, Annandale, Virginia. as a result of a truly providential traffic stop back in 2004. This document is a secret plan that the Muslim Brotherhood did not expect us to ever see. It was meant as a report from their senior leadership here in the United States back to the mothership in Egypt. And among other things, it laid out how the Muslim Brotherhood was going to accomplish this mission statement. I don't know if you can read it, but it says the following, that they are engaged, the Brotherhood, in America in a kind of civilization jihad, in eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within. By their hands, meaning ours, and the hands of the believers, so that God's religion is made victorious over all other religions. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't consider that to be particularly friendly, or benign, or the kind of attitude that you think of as the sort of people that you can safely do business with. These are some of the examples of what civilization jihad involves in practice. I'm going to talk a little bit about the first in detail, but let me just mention a couple of, I'll hit the second one actually, too. Educational vehicles, figuring out ways to get inside our academic institutions, to promote a favorable understanding of Islam and diminish a more realistic view of what the jihadists are up to. Getting Sharia into our courts, colonization of America, interfaith dialogue, Sharia-compliant finance. These are lots of different pieces. We don't have time tonight to go into all of them. I'll talk about a couple of them quickly. But just on the personnel, Claire was blamed by the ophthalmologist for suggesting that the Muslim Brotherhood has penetrated the U.S. government. You can take it to the bank, folks. These are 6 examples that I developed in a course that's available at muslimbrotherhoodinamerica.com. Again, I won't have time to go to all of them, but I would introduce the lady up in the upper left. You may know her as Mrs. Anthony Weiner. Also does business as Huma Abedin. She was most recently the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. She is now working with her on her campaign for the presidency, and she had been with her for years before that. But I want to focus on this cat, a fellow by the name of Muhammad Biari, because his story is a prime example of how civilization jihad works in America and the real progress it's been making. Biari is based out in Plano, Texas. He founded a group called the Freedom and Justice Foundation. If that sounds familiar, that's the same name that has been chosen by the Muslim Brotherhood to describe their operations, including the party that they took over Egypt briefly with a few years back. This is Muhammad Biari, next to the man who is now the Chief of Police of Commissioner of Police in New York City. At the time was the Commissioner of Police in Los Angeles with Janet Napolitano, then the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, swearing him in as an advisory member for the department. And in the course of his service in that regard, Biari was selected by then Director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, to receive the FBI's top civilian award for his service to our country and extraordinary contributions to specific cases. Interestingly enough, the place, the venue for this award was the FBI Training Academy in Quantico, Virginia. This is also, by the way, the home of the FBI Training Academy's library, as you might expect. About 6 days after the award, a series of screeds began appearing in something called Wired magazine, written by a radical leftist by the name of Spencer Ackerman, denouncing the kinds of books that are used or other course material by the FBI in training agents to understand the nature of the enemy we are confronting. On October 4th, Muhammad Biari and a bunch of leftist groups, as well as Muslim Brotherhood organizations, wrote the FBI director, Robert Mueller at the time, to say, you need to purge the FBI's files of this kind of offensive material. A short while later, on the 19th of October, 57 groups, some of them leftists, some of them Islamists, what you might think of as a red-green coalition or axis, came together to say to the then then Homeland Security Advisor to the President of the United States, John Brennan, you know, it's not enough to purge the files of the FBI and the trainers that use the material in those files of this offensive material. We want you also to purge the materials that are used by the Department of Defense, the military. We want you to purge the files of the FBI. We want you to purge the files of the Homeland Security Department. In other words, we don't want any of this information that might actually help the people that we're counting on to protect us against these enemies to know what moves these enemies, what they're about. Well, on the 11th of November, John Brennan agreed to that purge. As I mentioned, one of the other kinds of civilization jihad is trying to get into our courts the use of Sharia. Not our Constitution, not the laws that flow from it, but Sharia to adjudicate matters, creating a parallel system of Islamic tribunals that would be used in parallel with our courts, as is now being done in Britain. And you can bet there and here, if they have their way, our constitutional rights will be diminished. I want to talk about one other kind of jihad that is also at work. It's kind of the handmaiden of the civilization jihad, also at the moment in non-violent. I think of it as less non-violent than pre-violent, what these guys are doing, because it's all about creating conditions under which the preferred kind of jihad can actually be implemented. What do I mean by institutional jihad? This is an organization you may never have heard of. It is arguably the most powerful multinational bloc in the world today. It's called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, or OIC. It effectively runs this outfit, the United Nations, and with the help of our own administration, has formed a quite formidable, as I say, red-green axis. Red for the leftists, green for the Islamists. Let me give you a couple of examples. The Hijra, I mentioned that earlier. What does that term mean? Hijra is the term that has been used in Islam from Muhammad's day to describe the migration that he made from Mecca to Medina. It's become institutionalized as something that faithful Muslims should do. It's a colonization. It is meant to be used to move Muslims from areas in which they are a majority to areas where they are not, and then become, in due course, the majority. What we're seeing the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the United Nations, and the Obama administration doing to facilitate this kind of colonization is using instruments like our refugee resettlement program and our asylum programs and our visa lottery programs to bring immense numbers of Muslims here. I'm quite certain that in that population there are Muslims that are simply yearning to live the American dream, to have the kinds of opportunities and live the kinds of lives that we treasure. In most cases, I suspect they're trying to get away from Sharia in their home countries. The problem is that there are large numbers of these folks who are coming from places where Sharia is not only the norm, but they are bringing it with them. They're moving into areas of the country in large numbers, and they are, by and large, not assimilating. And there is, unfortunately, growing reason to be concerned that they are seeking to incubate sort of their own Sharia program in lots of places in this country. In addition, we of course have the problem of people coming across the border illegally. This is a photograph of a man finding what is not uncommon these days along the border, Qurans and, in this case, a prayer rug. This is potentially a very significant security problem. And what we're also seeing at the moment, fostered by the Obama administration, is something called Welcoming New Americans. This is an initiative aimed at suppressing what they actually explicitly call the resistance to these populations being brought to cities and towns across the country without any preparation, without any prior notice or consultation about how they'll be integrated into the community. This is another kind of civilization jihad, or institutional jihad, if you will, because the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, I think as Matt indicated, has had this as one of their express objectives for a decade. In fact, a decade ago, they adopted something called the 10-year plan of action. The 10-year plan of action is explicitly designed to get every nation in the world to take steps to prohibit speech or other expression that is offensive to Muslims. Kind of like that material in the FBI training materials, but also the kind of thing that Pamela Geller was doing down at Garland, Texas, and, well, frankly, this kind of address to you. And the question is, are we going to allow this kind of restriction, or Sharia blasphemy law, if you will, to be imposed upon us, either explicitly, officially, in the form of, say, hate speech laws, as we now have in Britain. John talked about Geert Wilders, a man who has now been prosecuted not once but twice. This is a member of parliament in the Netherlands, but twice he's been prosecuted on the grounds that he is making offensive remarks to Muslims. And he pointed out that they were true. They are from the text of the Quran or other sources. And he was told that the truth is not a defense against hate speech. Now, are we that far from it now? Let me just conclude by pointing out, as I kind of alluded to at the beginning, what do all of these folks have in common? Whether they're with the Islamic State, whether they're working with Al-Qaeda, whether they're working with the Taliban, or Boko Haram, or Al-Shabaab, or any number of the other proudly violent jihadists, or whether they're working with the Muslim Brotherhood, or any of its various offshoots, or whether they're with the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, or other groups that I haven't mentioned. What do they have in common? They have in common Sharia. They have in common a commitment to this program, this doctrine that, as I said, is drawn from the sacred texts, from the jurisprudence, from the practices, from the traditions of the faith. It is a comprehensive, totalitarian, political, military, and legal program that is to govern all aspects of a Muslim's life. And by the way, the object of the exercise is to make sure that everybody else submits to it. Whether they practice it or not, they simply must submit to it. The fact that this is a supremacist program that has explicitly world conquest at its core is the crux of the problem. It is fundamentally about power, not faith. Its adherents are obliged to impose it, and jihad is the way to do it. American laws for American courts. We were talking about this over dinner. It's a very important initiative. Don't know if it'll ever make it here in Massachusetts, but in 10 states around the country it has. It simply says our laws, our Constitution should govern, not the laws of any foreign nation or foreign power. Not Sharia explicitly or solely. We're hitting on this idea. You almost certainly have run across it at some point, usually in connection with the odd package sitting someplace like a bus station or an airport. See something, say something. Well, we're going to build a campaign around the idea that if you see Sharia, you better say something about it. That's freedom of speech. That's courageous.
Just an obvious point, we've got to get our hands around the border insecurity, and we've got to stop the abuse of the refugee program. And I will just conclude with one that really worries me. Kill shot for our enemies is the vulnerability of our electric grid. We believe that that is of surpassing importance to get fixed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. I'd next like to call on Clare Lopez.
Thanks to all of you for coming out here tonight. It's really a privilege to be back here at this synagogue and to see so many friendly faces and new ones too. What is the enemy ideology that we're facing? What does it consist of? What I'd like to do now is to take just a few minutes to talk to you about the consequences of such ideology, such policies being implemented by our national security leadership, by our White House and President, and the effect and the unfortunate outcomes that we're seeing across the world. I'm going to call this a president, a book, and a bomb. You can guess, I imagine, who the president is. I'm going to talk mostly about Iran, but let me start with this. The world right now, and what we're looking at, what we're seeing in the world today, this is what it looks like when America switches sides in the global war of jihad. This is what it looks like when America flips, switches sides in the war against terrorism, or what used to be called the war on terrorism. Now, I want to start, like I said, with the president and his policies and the policies of this administration. There was something called a Presidential Study Directive, PSD 11, as it turns out, PSD 11, which was put out in about the year 2011 by this White House. So this document remains classified, but we know from leaks that it deals with the president's, the administration's desire that America would help the Muslim Brotherhood to power, to overthrow sitting governments around the world, in particular the Middle East, North Africa region, and to replace those governments, many of them our allies of many decades, replace them with Sharia-compliant governments, regimes under the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, obviously, the outcomes that we're seeing today are chaotic. There's no question. And I would say that the administration and the president probably did not foresee just how chaotic things would become. They just thought, well, Muslim Brotherhood would be a great idea. Let's bring them to power and everything will be fine. What could go wrong? Well, we see what could go wrong. They didn't just goof. This was their policy. This was their agenda to do this. Even if it took, as in Libya, I'll talk about Libya some here, throwing in with al-Qaeda militias to do that. Now let me talk briefly about Benghazi, and I think probably Admiral Lyons is also going to address this, but I will briefly too. The Barack Obama administration, in coordination specifically with the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton at the time, now a presidential candidate, decided to aid and abet al-Qaeda terrorists and Libyan Muslim Brotherhood jihadis to overthrow our ally at the time, Muammar Gaddafi, and replace him with a Muslim Brotherhood government. Now, Muammar Gaddafi was no choir boy and was never going to be. But at the time, and I'm talking about 2011, he was our ally and had been for a number of years. He had given up his weapons of mass destruction. He also stopped his support for terrorism, which had been going on with him for decades prior to that, gave it up. And instead, he was working with us to keep al-Qaeda down. He had al-Qaeda in his jails. So he was our ally. And we decided, no, he was not the leader that we wanted. Neither was Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. Neither was Ben Ali in Tunisia. They needed to go. Well, at the same time, this is exactly what al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood had decided too, that these guys needed to go. And why? Because they were not enforcing Sharia. And we, not we, our administration, our national security leadership decided that was a good idea. We were going to go along with that. And we helped to overthrow Gaddafi, and we did it in part by running guns to al-Qaeda. Christopher Stevens began as the envoy to the rebels in Libya in 2011, before he became ambassador. That means that Christopher Stevens was America's first envoy to al-Qaeda, because that was his job. His job was to work with al-Qaeda militias and make sure they won the war. Well, he helped Qatar, which was running guns financed by the United Arab Emirates, run those guns to al-Qaeda militias in 2011. Then later the next year, in 2012, after he became ambassador, he helped send weapons out of Libya. The flow reversed, in other words. Went out of Libya, this time on Turkish ships bound for delivery to al-Qaeda and Muslim Brotherhood-dominated Syrian rebels, but the same agenda: bring Sharia enforcing Islamic regimes to power. That is the policy of our administration, and it is the outcome of exactly the kind of infiltration and subversion, institutionalization of that infiltration and subversion that you just heard Frank talk about. So once the government or the regime of Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown, our administration needed to show that things were great. This was a success. You know, the Muslim Brotherhood's in power in Egypt at this time. We're in 2012 now. You know, Muammar Gaddafi's been overthrown in Libya. This is the outcome they sought. This is the outcome they wanted. Now, obviously, the outcome was not optimal. Things were terrible, especially in Libya. But that was also presidential election year, and that election had to be won by President Obama. And so you ask about why the mission, special mission compound is what we call it, or the ambassador's compound in Benghazi, was refused for every single one of its requests during 2012 for more security. Well, the answer to that is optics. It wouldn't look good if they put a machine gun nest or sandbag emplacements up on the flat roof of that villa. It was a villa located in a residential neighborhood. It wouldn't look good. And besides, you know, the neighbors really wouldn't like it. Well, you know who moved in next door to that villa? Ansar al-Sharia. Ansar al-Sharia, al-Qaeda, group of groups of militias that banded together in 2012 after the revolution. State Department knew that. State Department knew Ansar al-Sharia was living next door to our ambassador's compound. They didn't care. No security for you. And the security that was already in the country got pulled out. Optics. I guess the hope was, hoping against hope, they could just get through the November 2012 election, and they were willing to risk American lives to do it. That's the worst part about this. It wasn't just that they were pursuing a mistaken agenda, or that they were mistaken about not providing enough security and made a bad judgment about how much was enough or not enough. They knew. They knew that the al-Qaeda forces and militias across Libya, and especially in Benghazi, were attacking all other Western interests in the country. The British pulled out, the Red Cross pulled out, and our people were forced to stay, but minus security. And it was all because they had to make it look like what their policy had been in 2011 to overthrow Gaddafi, install the Muslim Brotherhood, was right. The outcome they sought was not to be. 4 Americans died because of it. They had received multiple explicit warnings before the attack of September the 11th and 12th, 2012. The first attack, or the first warning should have been the date itself, 9/11. The next explicit warning was a 10-day out warning, came at the beginning of September. It was explicit. The security team guys who came out publicly last year published a book called 13 Hours in Benghazi, went on Fox and other media to talk about their experiences that night. They said that 10 days in advance, that means the very beginning of September, explicit warning that the American mission would be attacked. No response. Next, you had the YouTube video. This is the red herring video, right? Came out on September the 9th because an Egyptian TV talk show host played parts of it on TV that day, September 9, and invited Arab-Muslim outrage, which quickly built. The embassy in Cairo tracked it through social media. They knew that the Muslim world, not just Cairo, was getting ready to explode. That should have been enough. The next alert came, the warning, very explicit, on September the 10th. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of al-Qaeda, put out a video on jihadist websites, and in that video, he called explicitly, "O sons of Libya, rise up and kill Americans," because the CIA killed his deputy, a Libyan, Abu Yahya Libby, in the Afghanistan-Pakistan area a few months prior with the drone strike. So that video is out there the day before. I think that probably was the green light to Al-Qaeda for the attack. Nobody that I've talked to even knew about the video, at the time at least. They had no idea, nobody saw it, nobody paid attention. Explicit warning, Ayman al-Zawahiri, head of Al-Qaeda, go attack Americans, right over their heads. And then finally, the morning of September the 11th, 2012, the Annex guys, the Annex is where the CIA base of operations was located, a short distance, about a mile and a half away from the ambassador's compound. They sent one of their team members over to the ambassadors explicitly that very morning to say the attack is coming. Ambassador, would you and your people like to come and co-locate with us over at the Annex? We're better defended. We've got security there. Come over there and be with us, and you'll be safer. And he turned that down. We don't know why. Let's talk about the cover-up very quickly, because I do want to get to Iran yet. The cover-up that went afterwards gets to something that Frank was talking about, and that's why I want to highlight it. It fit perfectly with the agenda of the Obama administration as regards Islamic law on slander. In other words, the attack on free speech, and coincides as well with the agenda of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC. The blaming of the YouTube video by our administration, Clinton, Obama, the spokespeople for both State Department and the White House, et cetera, through the administration, for 2 full weeks after that attack, blamed this video called Innocence of Muslims. It's about the life of Muhammad. By the way, it's a horribly made video if you've ever seen the clip online. It's technically just garbage, but everything in it is true. It comes straight out of the Sirah, that is the biography as we have it brought down to us of Muhammad, or the Hadiths, or the Quran, or all of the above. But they blame that video completely speciously, knowing full well from the moment of the attack, literally, that it was a terrorist attack by Al-Qaeda. They knew that immediately. But they chose to blame this video. Why? Why? People ask. You think, why they blame the video? There were no demonstrations in Libya. 0. None. No protests in Benghazi at all about this video. They knew that, and still they lied about it. Well, but it fit with the agenda. The agenda was that Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, had worked very closely with the OIC to criminalize the criticism of Islam, to make that hate speech, in other words. In something called the Istanbul process that refers to a series of meetings held first in Istanbul and then in other cities around the world, including Washington, D.C., where Secretary Clinton worked with the Secretary General, at that time Turkish Secretary General of the OIC, named Ahmed Issanoglu, literally to coincide, to work with the 10-year program of action that you heard Frank talk about of the OIC to achieve in America the criminalization of the criticism of Islam, to curtail our free speech. In other words, again, if you don't criticize Islam, if you don't offend them, then they won't feel uncontrollably violent to kill you. That's called a heckler's veto, not just a heckler. It's called a murderer's veto over our free speech. But that's what they were trying to do. That's what they were working on. And so this video was the perfect vehicle to promote, at least for a time, that agenda after the attacks in Benghazi. And they could blame the video, they could have the filmmaker arrested, which was done. But the lie held for about 2 weeks. Culmination, of course, was at the United Nations General Assembly with our president taking to the podium. And his speech was about the video. They all were. All the OIC members' speeches were about the video and how awful free speech really was, and it had to be curtailed, and got to stop these people from talking about Muhammad like that. And our president gets up to the microphone for his turn in his speech, and he says,
"The future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam.
The future must not belong to those who criticize the Prophet of Islam." So much for upholding the American Constitution and the First Amendment. The book I want to talk about is Robert Baer's 2009 book called The Devil We Know. The Devil We Know is about how the United States ought to recognize Iran as the regional hegemonic power, that the United States should accord respect to Iran, allow it to take over the Saudi oil fields. He says that explicitly in the book. And also Mecca and Medina, because after all, the poor Shiites, they've been locked out of administration of the two holy places of Islam for all these centuries, and they really ought to have a turn. So if the Shiites want to march on Mecca and Medina, we, the United States, ought to allow Iran to do that. Oh, and also, there's no reason why they shouldn't have a nuclear bomb. He writes all of this in the book. By the way, Robert Baer is a former agency, CIA operations officer. I didn't know him then. I have not met him yet to this day. And at the time I read this, and I thought, this book is nuts, this is bonkers. And I put it away on a shelf, and I just forgot about it until a couple of years ago. And then I pulled it out, and I said, wait a minute. This is the blueprint for the Obama administration policy in the Middle East. But how could he be even-handed? You know, there are Shiites and there are Sunnis. Well, North Africa, as we just talked about, was going to be for the Sunnis. I think that was the plan. And then the heartland of the Middle East over the Persian Gulf region was going to be for the Shiites. Obviously, the Sunnis are not going to go quietly about that. The rise of the Islamic State, or something Sunni like it, I think was inevitable. What happened is that the remnants of Saddam Hussein's old Ba'athist Revolutionary Council got together with what was left of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's old Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, other tribal elements. They found safe haven in a fellow Ba'athist regime in Damascus under Bashar al-Assad. And he basically let them in, let them survive, let them grow to power. And that is where the Islamic State came from. That is the origin of the Islamic State. Now, there were many who helped out with that process. Qatar, of course, Turkey. Turkey, in the way that they allowed, and still to this day, are allowing jihadis to cross their territory. 20 or so thousand from around the world have come to join this endeavor. The Islamic State has declared a new caliphate. This fulfills the hopes and the dreams of hundreds of millions of Muslims around the world. This is something they have dreamed of, wanted, and are rejoicing has been reestablished, whether they come over to join it personally or not. We, the United States, our administration helped because we allowed the weapons to flow out of Benghazi on Turkish ships for delivery to the Syrian rebels. Now, there were also CIA and special operations training camps in Jordan, also on the Turkish border with Syria. This is what our administration thought was a good idea, to help these Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda linked militias in Syria to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. They were kind of mixed up there, you see. The Middle East was supposed to be for the Iranians, and Bashar al-Assad is one of their puppets. But on the other side of that civil war in Syria are Muslim Brotherhood, so what to do? And that's why you see such a muddle out of our White House policy. They don't know which way to go. We do have obligations to friends and allies in the region. Israel certainly would be number one. Also Jordan, and as I said, the Kurds. Core compelling United States national security interests, as I would see it for this part of the world in this particular stage that we're in right now, keep open the free flow of oil, the free passage of the seas. I think that's absolutely number one. Number two, protect our own facilities, diplomatic and military in the region, and our people. Defend, as I said, Israel, Jordan, and the Kurds, our natural allies in this area. And fight the global jihad movement wherever it may be. But never to simply help one set of jihadis, Shiites, against another set of jihadis, Sunnis. Finally, on the bomb. Iran's nuclear weapons program, I think, is very well along. We know that they are duplicitous. We know that there has not been one single time in all of the history of their program since 1988, when Ayatollah Khomeini began Iran's nuclear bomb program, that they have not had a clandestine element to it. The overt program, the open one, the one that's been revealed by outside forces, the opposition, satellite imagery, intelligence services. That's what they're talking about in the talks. They're not talking about the clandestine program. We have to be ready to get ready to defend Israel if and when it decides it cannot wait anymore to strike against Iran's nuclear weapons capability, because it's existential for Israel. We must prepare for that eventuality and prepare for how in the public forum, in faith communities like this, in the media, in whatever forums we can get to, that we are ready to stand up and defend Israel when they do move. They may have to do that eventually at some point. And then finally, no time to go into a whole lot of detail, but be aware that Iran and Hezbollah have a very extensive operational terror network across the Western Hemisphere, including inside the United States itself. We need to be aware of that, and we need to be prepared to recognize that when it becomes obvious. If a strike were to occur of any kind against Iran, it may be that the Hezbollah elements would be activated in this country. Need to be aware of that. All right, on that very gloomy note, I will conclude, and thank you very much.
I would like to welcome the Admiral.
Okay. Well, it's nice to be back in the Boston area here. And I want to really send a special thanks to all of you for coming here tonight. Because by your presence, you tell me you recognize we have a problem. We have not only a constitutional problem, but we have a national security problem. Now, I've got to tell you, never in my lifetime did I believe that I would witness the takedown of this great country and withdrawn from our world leadership role by our own administration. That's exactly what's happening. This administration cannot even identify the enemy. It's not violent extremism. It's not radical Islam. That implies that there's some secular or Western version for Islam. There ain't. Erdogan, when he was Prime Minister of Turkey, said it best. Islam is Islam. There are no modifiers. Democracy is the train we ride to our ultimate objective. And the ultimate objective is to make the religion of Islam dominant, to replace our Constitution with Sharia law. So there's no mystery to what their objective is. And until you recognize that Islam is a political movement masquerading as a religion, you're not going to be successful in defeating it. Now, we've had many opportunities over the last 35 years to change the course of history. We have failed every one of them. And it hasn't mattered whether it's been a Republican or Democratic administration. I'll take you back to November 1979, when the Ayatollah Khomeini's goons took over our embassy in Tehran. I was the director of political and military affairs then for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the chairman called me up and he said, "What can we do?" I said, "I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to take our Navy SEAL teams and we're going in and we're going to take Carg Island, their main exporting depot. And I was going to give them 24 hours to get out of the embassy, or they were going to have the biggest ashtray in the Middle East." Of course, that promptly got rejected by Jimmy Carter. Iran then went on its killing spree, kidnappings, and so on. And the next major event was the blow-up of our embassy in Beirut, April 1983. 64 people were killed, and our key Mid-East intelligence officer, Robert Ames, was killed. Tragic loss. That was followed by the Marine barracks blow-up, October 23rd, 1983. Now, that bombing never had to happen. On the 27th of September, the National Security Agency put out a message, highly classified message. We used to have a tap on the Iranian ambassador's line in Damascus. And what it said, it was the Iranian ambassador reporting back to the foreign ministry in Tehran on the orders that he received from them, which was, have the various groups concentrate their attacks on the multinational force, but take a spectacular action against the United States Marines. 27 September 1983, a month before the attack. I, as the deputy chief, never got to see that message until 2 days after the attack. Where was it? I've never been able to find out. Casey, who was CIA director, then called me out to Lyons. And he said, if we found out who did it, would I make up the plans to take him out? I said, of course. And he said, well, there's one stipulation. Whatever we give you, you cannot share with the Joint Staff. Because he didn't want to read about it in the Washington Post the next day. I agreed. Long story short, we found out who did it. It was the Islamic Amal in bed with the Hezbollah, and they were holed up in the Sheikh Abdullah barracks above Baalbek. And what I did, I couried the plans to the carriers. Because at that time, 1983, I knew the Soviets were reading our comms. I thought the leak was in NATO. This is before we knew about John Walker, who was selling them our codes. I had briefed the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I briefed Weinberger, went over everything with him, who was the Secretary of Defense then. We had the planes loaded. We were ready to go. And at the critical meeting in the White House, when trying to get the final execution order out of the president, Weinberger told the president, he said, oh, I think there are Lebanese army troops in those barracks. And what we were going to do was make the Sheikh Abdullah barracks look like a plowed cornfield in Iowa. There was going to be nothing left of the Hezbollah core group. Next day, so we come back, next meeting, lo and behold, no Lebanese army troops. And I get this from Schultz and Schultz and McFarlane. Weinberger starts waving his arms. We're going to lose all our Arab friends if we go ahead with this strike. And we never got the orders. To this day, I've never been able to figure out who got the Weinberger. So what happened? We then went on. Osama bin Laden picked up on that. It became his rallying cry. The Americans can't suffer casualty. We lost 241 of our finest military personnel. And what did we do? In the eyes of the Middle East, we cut and ran. It was his rallying cry. The next opportunity came in the Gulf Tanker War. August 1987. Here, Iran is involved in a life and death struggle with Iraq. I had two carrier battles, this time I was close to the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet. I had two carrier battle groups, a battleship battle group and an amphibious sortie group. We were going to march up the Gulf and basically wipe out everything in its path. I briefed Weinberger at Pearl Harbor in June We sent updated plans and so forth. We never could get authority to execute. Well, think of what we could have done had we executed what I wanted to do. The theocracy would have been gone, and we wouldn't be where we are today. Now, moving along, we wound up with Barack Obama and how he was going to fundamentally change America.
We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America.
And you have to ask yourself, if you loved America and you believed in its greatness and its exceptionalism, what is it you wanted to change? Wouldn't you want to build on it? But of course, with his Marxist background and his schooling from Franklin Marshall Davis, he had been taught America has caused many of the world's problems. Therefore, anything that undercuts America's influence and power is seen as being objectively progressive. We looked at his strategy to fundamentally transform America. Well, what was it? It was anti-American, anti-Western, but pro-Islam, pro-Iranian, and pro-Muslim Brotherhood. Now, how could an American president embrace the Muslim Brotherhood, whose creed is to destroy the United States from within with our own miserable hands and replace our Constitution with Sharia law? When you want to take a country down, the first thing you do is you undercut the military. And that's what's behind the unilateral disarmament of our military forces. This is really a planned agenda, in my view. Sequestration became the perfect storm for the Obama administration. Look, the defense budget is 20% of the federal budget. But under sequestration, we're required to eat 50%. I mean, we're headed for the smallest army since prior to World War II, 420,000 troops, trying to meet our worldwide commitments. The Chief of Staff of the Army has said he's not sure he can prevail in a major regional war. Unconscionable. The Air Force had something like 184 squadrons during the George W. Bush era. They're down to something like 47 now. And the readiness of those 47 hover around 50%. And then we have the glorious Navy. The Navy we have today is roughly 278 ships. That's what's left of Ronald Reagan's 600-ship Navy. To put that number in perspective, that's the number of ships I had under my command in the Pacific Fleet. Ought to scare the hell out of you. We're headed for the smallest Navy since prior to World War I, not World War II. And at the same time, what are our enemies doing? They're modernizing everything. China is building 60 ships a year. We're building 10 to 12, 13, and 20% of those are those sorry-ass little combat ships that have no offensive or defensive capability. Compounding the problem is the social engineering that has been forced on our military services, which has destroyed unit integrity, cohesiveness, and most importantly, the will to win. Don't let anybody tell you the removal of don't ask, don't tell has been a great success. And the same with women in combat. And let me tell you, there are many viable roles for women in the military. Combat is not one of them. Now, I'm going to say a few words about the Iranian nuclear program. It's all a sham. The core elements of Iran's nuclear program remain totally intact. In fact, their batch of enriched uranium has increased by another 20 to 40% while these negotiations have been going on. And why do I say it's all a sham? Well, I want to take you back to 4 June 2008, when candidate Obama received the Democratic nomination to be President of the United States. And the message was to the Ayatollahs, don't sign any agreement with the Bush administration or the other European members. You will get a much better deal from me. You will like my policies. I am a friend of Iran. This borders on treason. And let me tell you, you all remember 9/11 only too well. 9/11 couldn't have been carried out without the material and training support provided by Iran to the 9/11 hijackers. And 3,000 innocent Americans who were doing nothing more than going to work would be alive today. I want to say a few words on Benghazi. This was a Hillary scenario. The pathological liar. Her term at the State Department put the for sale sign out on the State Department. Her emails, every one of our enemies, you know, have hacked into those emails. They've got the full book on her. She's totally compromised. She's damaged goods. There's no way she can be allowed back in the White House. And as Claire mentioned, Benghazi, Libya, never had to happen. 10,000 people didn't have to lose their lives. We had truce negotiations going on with Gaddafi. And things were being worked out until Hillary met with a Muslim Brotherhood representative in the Paris Westin Hotel for 45 minutes and canceled the negotiations. And over the objections of all military and intelligence advice, she drove us into the war in Libya. Never had to happen, and you got the chaotic situation that we have today. And a few words on Ambassador Stevens. Of course, as I mentioned to you, we had both strategic and tactical warning of that attack. There was no mystery what was going to happen. In fact, we had specific warning, 10 days that attack was going to occur. Now, I have to ask you, if you're the Secretary of Defense and you are the SINC in command of that region and the supporting SINC, which was SINC-UR, who had all the resources, would you not reposition forces to counter such an attack? I mean, And if you were Ambassador Stevens, he had to know that that place was going to be attacked. Would any one of you say, oh, here I go, doop-de-doop, over to Benghazi? Of course not. Our Med was emptied of resources, except for a few. We had a destroyer at Ceuta Bay in Crete. We had a destroyer in Rota, Spain. But we did have at Sigonella a Marine fast team, 40-member counter-terrorist team with their own aircraft. We also had a 130-man Marine Force recon team at Sigonella. We had F-16 aircraft available. None of it was employed. So here we are. We've got a hell of a mess on our hands. Chaotic situation in the Middle East. The Sunni Shia split, sectarian, we don't want to get, but you can't, that's a no-win situation for us. I'm under no illusion that anything is going to change during this administration. But for the next administration, they have to be prepared to take very positive action. The first thing they have to do is cancel the sham agreement with Iran. This makes absolutely no sense with the mindset of the Khomeini 12ers to put a nuclear weapon in their hand. This is suicidal. Now, how do we prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon capable? The next thing we have to do is totally wipe it out with a military strike. We have the capability to do it. And along with that strike, I'm going to take you back to 1987. I'm going to wipe out every other major military facility they have, which would interfere with the flow of oil in the Gulf. Along with that, the Muslim Brotherhood fifth column must be routed out of our government. This is madness. We've let them penetrate every national security and intelligence agency. It's the same as the communists in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. That's where we are today. This has to be done with a sophisticated plan. And I recognize no candidate can come out and say what I just said to you. But we have to provide those candidates who we think have the ability to win and the backbone to act in the best interest of America, this type of support and direction so they can put this nation back in the lead where it belongs.